Okay, everybody, I think we're going to go ahead and get started, and we might still have a few people join us, and I will try to get as many people in as we go. And here's another one. Click. There we go. So I'm seeing some smiling faces, which means you're hearing me, which is always good. So everybody give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Ha, put my mind at ease. Technology is great when it works. So welcome everybody, and I hope everybody had a great week. And I'm seeing some familiar faces, which is great. I like to see familiar faces, but for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, my name is Betsy Solomon, and I am an art historian, and I'm also the executive director of the Shepherd Center of Webster-Kirkwood in the St. Louis area. So thanks for joining our weekly online art history lectures. So before we get started today, and I know this is a review for some of you, but before we get started, I just want to do a few technical comments for people who might be using Zoom for the first time or are not as familiar. The first thing is that I have muted everyone except myself, obviously. And the reason for that is just because we do have quite a few people on the line. Right now we have 44 people online. And with all of that, there's going to be a lot of background noise. So we had to mute everybody. But I do want for us to be able to talk as much as we can in this media. And so what you're going to need to do is to use your chat box. And there will be a few times during the presentation that I'll ask some questions of you, just kind of for conversation and discussion. And you'll want to, if you choose to respond, you'll want to respond in your chat box. So I'm using a laptop computer, and some of you might be using other kinds of devices, but on my computer, I have a Zoom toolbar that's towards the bottom of the screen, and there's an icon that says chat, and it kind of looks like a little word bubble. And if you click on that, you'll be given the opportunity to type in a comment, and then everyone will be able to see it. So it's helpful to try to keep your comments kind of short because I have to glance at them as quickly as I can, and we'll be able to have some discussion that way. Now, I'll also mention that sometimes with all these people on the line, so many come in so fast that I might miss them. And if I miss your comment, I'm not trying to miss your comment, I'm just getting as many as we can. So please participate if you would like. Now, also, I am recording this session for many reasons. And one is because with all of these different internet connections, sometimes things don't work the way we expect them to. And so if you're having technical difficulty, you will be able to access a recording of this presentation from the Shepherd Center of Webster-Kirkwood's website. We have a special page now for online classes, and we have links to recordings for the classes that our Shepherd Center is hosting. So you have the opportunity to do it that way. And at the end of the presentation, I have that web address for anybody who would like to write it down. Now, last housekeeping detail, and that is that we do not have class next week. I have a prior commitment next Friday, so we're not going to have class. Another good reason why the recordings could be fun. If you want to catch a lecture that you haven't seen before, you can do that next Friday or anytime. But we will resume on May 22nd. And when we resume on May 22nd, we're going to be talking about Donatello. So you don't want to miss that. So with all of that said, we're going to start talking about some Renaissance art. And so today we're going to be talking about Masaccio, which is a very important Renaissance artist. Now, looking to talk about Renaissance art, it's, within the history of art, it's always a very important thing to be familiar with the Renaissance artists. And the reason for that is because they left behind such an important and strong legacy for the generation of artists that follow. Our Renaissance artists, they really created a very high standard for excellence in art, especially with regard to naturalism, and especially with regard to illusionism of space. And that really is held up as a standard for several generations of artists that follow in European painting. And it really isn't overturned, if that's the right word. It really isn't replaced by a new standard until we get to Impressionism in the later part of the 19th century. So very influential group of artists. Now today, Masaccio is, of course, a painter. But through the course of our series that we're in the midst of, we will be looking at sculptors, and in an act of inclusiveness, which is always important to me, we'll be looking at a selection of women artists too. But today we're going to look at Masaccio and tell you a little bit of his story. I think of history as a story, so we're going to tell the story of his life in short and look at his artwork and a few bits of history. So with all of that said, I'm going to share my screen so we can all see some Masaccio. Here we go. One moment, please. All right. Let me get this set. All right, now just to do a check, the first person that I'm seeing is Cheryl Downs. Cheryl Downs, are you seeing this screen? Got it. Thank you, Cheryl. I like to check. It just makes me feel better. I'm going to get one more thing set here for us. Oops. Sorry for the delay. I just got a bunch of little things to set here. All right, so let's do some talking about Masaccio. Now, this is a self-portrait of Masaccio. And it is, as you can see, it's kind of, this face is in the middle of several figures because Masaccio actually painted his face into a crowd scene of people in one of his frescoes. And so he's kind of like one of those hidden details in one of his paintings, which Renaissance artists do very often. We'll see several incidents of that today. So, but it gives us a wonderful image of his face as we think about him and his life. Now, Masaccio lived from 1401 to 1428. Very short lifespan. He died when he was 27. And he is one of the first painters to truly introduce innovation into the world of art during the Italian Renaissance. And many of art historians refer to him as the founder of Renaissance painting because he really ushered in a new era of painting with many of his innovations. Now, he was important as a painter in his own right, as we'll see, what he gave to us into the legacy of Renaissance art, but he's also very influential on later artists who study his work and incorporate what they learned from Masaccio into their own careers. And chief among them is Michelangelo, which we'll see at the very end of the presentation today. Now, I'll point out, just to give us a sense of context, that Masaccio was a contemporary of Piero della Francesca. So for those of you who joined us last week, Masaccio and Piero della Francesca were working in Florence at the same time, so they certainly were acquainted with each other. Now, Masaccio was born in San Giovanni Valdarno, which is near Florence, on December 21st of 1401. And I'm going to admit another person into our group. There we go. And his real name, his given name, is Tommaso di Ser Giovanni di Moni. So that's a mouthful. So his nickname was Masaccio. And his nickname is actually kind of funny because if you translate the nickname Masaccio in Italian, it turns out to be like Big Sloppy Tom. So there was, or like Clumsy Tom, something like that. And there was another artist working in Florence at the time whose nickname was Masolino. And if you translate Masolino in Italian, it's more like small or delicate Tom. And the two of them actually, so they were both Tommasos. So they both got these nicknames. So we have Big Clumsy Tom and we have Little Tom. And they sometimes collaborated together. So that's how those nicknames came about. So we'll just call him Masaccio because that's a lot quicker to say than his whole given name. Now, Masaccio's father was a notary, and his father died when Masaccio was 5. So his mother remarried, and she remarried a man who was an apothecary, and he was able to provide for the financial needs of their family. And so his stepfather died in August of 1417. And so the family moved to Florence. Now, after the move to Florence, we don't really have a lot of knowledge as to the artistic training of Masaccio, but we do know that he joined the Painters Guild in Florence at age 21 on January 7th of 1422. So we have the beginning of his official painter professional career then. Now, there's very few works by Masaccio that survive, but I find that to be a little bit of a deceiving statement. And the reason for that is because, first of all, some of his works are pretty large-scale commissions for whole fresco cycles. So it might be one commission, but it could be 10 paintings within that one commission. And another reason why it's kind of, we kind of have to think in terms of scale with the amount of work that Masaccio produced, is that many of his commissions were fresco cycles. So the paintings were literally placed upon the walls of buildings, upon the walls of churches and chapels. And so some of those buildings no longer exist. And so the frescoes went away with them. And then, of course, because he died when he was 27. So if he entered the Painters Guild when he was 21 and he died when he was 27, that's only at best a 7-year career. So if you think about the amount of work we know of Masaccio and we think in terms of 7 years, it's an amazing output. So there might be fewer paintings, but considering the time frame, it's an amazing output. So he gave to us the beginnings of many of the innovations of the Renaissance. So I find, and excuse me, I'm going to have to pause for a minute. We've got another person to click in. I find when we study Masaccio, it's important that we look to the artistic context that he was working in order to really understand some of these innovations. So there's two really important key ideas when we look at the work of Masaccio in artistic context. And one is architecture and one is sculpture. So I brought in this example of architecture for us to look at first. So we know that the developments of the Renaissance begin in the early 1400s, and they begin in the city of Florence. And some of the very earliest of those developments actually do begin within the field of architecture, and notably among the work of architect Brunelleschi. So Masaccio was a friend of Brunelleschi. He studied Brunelleschi's architecture in his work, and it did have some effect on his painting. So what we're looking at right here, this is the nave of the Church of San Lorenzo in Florence. And when we think about Renaissance architecture, the thinkers of the day, the artists of the day are really inspired by looking back to the classical past. So they're looking back to Greek and Roman architecture. And the elements of Greek and Roman architecture that they found particularly compelling were the sense of proportion that we have within the architectural schemes and the symmetry that we have within the architectural schemes. So basically what architects like Brunelleschi and others were doing is they were looking back to those orders, those architectural orders of the Greeks and the Romans, and they were studying their systems of proportion, and they were trying to emulate it within their own work that they were creating. So for anyone who studied architecture, which of course I have only done from an architecture or art historical point of view, but when we look to Greek architecture, for example, there are certain orders that are followed. So you have a certain kind of a base to a building, and then you have a certain kind of a base to a column, and then you have the column shaft, and then you have the column capital. And then there's certain methods by which you structure sequence of arches and such. So the Renaissance architects, they studied those orders of ancient architecture, and they incorporated it into their work. And it was all very mathematical with its sense of proportion. So relating this to art, so what artists like Masaccio did is they were able to apply some of the mathematical proportion of architecture into their painting. So the next name that kind of pops into the story is Leon Battista Alberti. And Leon Battista Alberti, he was truly a Renaissance man and a Renaissance thinker. And he was he dabbled in architecture and art, and he was a writer and a philosopher and just a very astute man. And he wrote a treatise called Della Pictura, or On Painting. And in that treatise, he applied these systems of proportion in architecture to painting. And when he did that, he came up with something called linear perspective. And that is a key idea in Renaissance art. So these diagrams that you're seeing in this slide next to the architectural view that we just saw are diagrams that explain to us how linear perspective works. So how I like to explain this to myself and to others is imagine a train track. So this bottom little picture here, this diagram kind of emulates a train track here. So if we're standing in the middle of a train track, which you should never do because that's not safe, but if we were, and we were looking off into the distance, we know that those two lines of the outside, like the two rails of the train track, we know them to be straight, because if they weren't straight, the train would not stay on the track. But as we look off to the distance, as far as our eyes can see, our eyes will see those two lines in the distance come together, because that's just how our optics work. So, but we know that they're not touching, but in the very far distance, when they meet the farthest horizon line that we can see, those lines are gonna look like they converge. So apply that idea, but think away the train track and just think about the lines. So this top part here shows us those lines. So here's our straight lines that are diagonally receding back in space, and in the very far distance, they converge at a vanishing point. Now let's look at our nave of San Lorenzo. The lines, let's look up here right on the top of the columns. You can see the architectural components in the lines. Now these are in real, this is a photograph of course, but these are in real space. And you see how even they, as we look back, look like they're diagonal as they recede back in space. Imagine them going straight through that wall, busting through that wall out to the horizon line, they would converge as well. So that's the relationship between the three-dimensional and the two-dimensional. Now a painter, looking at this top diagram, knows that if they organize their composition in the right way according to these orthogonals or these receding lines here, that they're going to be able to project an illusionistic sense of space. So this is where it's so important in the Renaissance to realize that math and science and art are all together. They're all the same thing. One influences the other. So that's thought one, and that's your, in a nutshell, lesson on linear perspective. So another key influence in the Italian Renaissance is ancient sculpture. And so this that you're looking at here is an ancient sculpture called the Doryphorus by artist Polykleitos. And the word Doryphorus in ancient Greek basically means spear bearer. So this sculpture literally originally would have been holding a spear in this hand. So it's a spear bearer is what that means. And so what our Renaissance artists are doing is they're looking back to the great accomplishments in ancient sculpture, and they're wanting to emulate these forms. And it's all about proportions, because the ancient Greeks certainly had a very exacting set of proportions for how they showed the human body. And the Renaissance artists wanted to emulate that. Another thing they wanted to emulate is this wonderfully naturalistic way that the Greeks were able to show the torsion or the balance or the turning of the human body. And it's this word we use often in art history from the Renaissance forward, the contrapposto pose. So basically what the contrapposto pose is it upholds this idea of the natural opposition of the human body. So imagine yourself walking. When you step forward with your left foot, your right arm goes out in space. So there's a natural opposition to the human body that creates a sense of balance as we walk and also as we move. And so the ancient Greeks and the Renaissance, emulating them, wanted to show that in their work. So this leg here, our Doryphorus his right leg, which is on our left side, it's what we call engaged. It's carrying the weight of the body. So we go diagonally to the other side of the body, this arm right here, and this arm is engaged. It would have been holding the spear. And then likewise, this is the relaxed leg, and this is the relaxed arm. So it's about naturalism with a sense of proportion of the human body and a very measured way of showing movement of the human body. And all of this comes together and it influences the work of our painters, and most certainly the work of Masaccio. So let's look at one of his paintings here. Now this is from an altarpiece, and now it is in the National Gallery in London, but originally would have been part, we're going to look at a digital reconstruction of the whole altarpiece in a moment, but it would have been kind of that central focal point in an altarpiece. And we obviously have a scene of Madonna and Child with angels. So as we look at this, I'm going to cast this question out to you, and you can give me some responses in your chat box. Just as you look at it, what are some of the details that suggest three-dimensional qualities in the painting? I'll give you a minute to kind of look and ponder and give me some responses. There we go. Okay, the arches. Absolutely, the arches and the angels behind and are partially behind. We'll look at those two. The niche itself, the space behind the arches, the cloths and the folds, just the fact that we know that this is flat and we're able to use the word behind to describe something. That right there, obviously our eyes are reading a sense of depth because we have things that are in the foreground and things that are behind. The cloth folds, the color changes from front to back. She's sitting on a chair, very much so. She seems to be inhabiting the space on that chair or on the throne. So let's look to some of these details. Let's look first to what we can just kind of call in this instance our architectural details. So let's look first to this throne. So the throne itself does have a very architectural quality to it because the ornamentation on it has these columns and such. And I think I have another person to admit. Here we go. All right, quick pause there. And so, but putting that throne there and the fact that it is so grand, so tall, it creates an architectural environment for the Madonna to sit in. So it's not like she's just floating in space. She's inhabiting a space. So let's look to either side of it. So not only do we have a niche-like quality that's created by the throne, we also are seeing some shadows. So on this side of the throne, we've got this brighter light. And so we can imagine that maybe there's a light that's kind of hanging kind of off to our left, maybe kind of or far like upper left, that is shining down. But her body is blocking some of the light here. So we have that sense of shadow. So not only do we have this architectural niche that's created with the throne, but it's also casting shadows. So that relates us to some three-dimensional quality. Now, just thinking about the idea of shadow, a lot of people were mentioning comments that really relate to this idea of light and shadow and how light behaves. So lots of people mention the folds of the drapery here. So as the light shines on her drapery, on her clothing, certain pieces of the drapery fall into shadow and some of them are illuminated. And so when we see the patterns of all of that here, it communicates to us that she has mass, she has three-dimensional quality. And not only the shadows with the drapery, but the way that the drapery pulls across her legs shows us that anatomy that's underneath. Now, the ancient Greeks in their sculpture, of course, ancient Greek sculpture is very oftentimes nude sculpture. And during the Renaissance, we have painters that are showing us clothed figures. So the way they show that three-dimensional quality, the way they reveal that anatomy underneath, is how the drapery behaves as it pulls around the human form. So we've got the architectural component, we've got the shadows of the folds of the Virgin Mary, and then we have this wonderful sense of foreground, middle ground, and background. So our angels here that are playing lutes, they're in our foreground as they sit on that step. And then kind of our middle ground here is the step in the throne, niche-like throne with the Virgin Mary. And then we have these angels that are behind. And placing them behind gives us this feeling of this illusionistic space that's going back. So what Masaccio has done is he's been able to model his figures and use patterns of light and shadow in order to emulate this sense of space. Now I'm getting a few other things. We'll talk more about the angels in front. And let's see. This was dated to 1426. So that's the date of 1426 is when it was completed. So it was done in several different pieces across time. So let's look a little bit more at these angels in the front. So we can certainly see the same kind of patterns of light and shadow on them. If you look at this one angel here, we certainly have a brightness across the top, and we have an illumination of this lute, whereas this angel here, the lute is in a greater sense of shadow. And we can see the turning of their bodies and the drapery as it behaves as well. So all of those elements carry through the many different pieces, many different details of the paintings. Okay, so let's look at this here. Now this is the reconstruction of the Pisa altarpiece. So this is what we just looked at. And the altarpiece was created for the Church of Santa Maria della Carmine in Pisa. And so you have to imagine that all of these various panel paintings would have been placed within a beautiful gilded wooden frame-like structure that would have brought them all together. And what happens, unfortunately, over time is that the pieces of those altarpieces are often separated from their original scheme, and the individual works end up in different museums all across the world. So I actually recreated this digitally. I did this several years ago, and I have to tell you, it took me way longer than it should have to get this all together. But I was vexed, and I wanted to make it happen. So here's all the pieces of the altarpiece, and we're going to look at two more of these in detail, but just to give you a sense of context. So here's our main zone here is our scene of the Madonna in Majesty, or we may call that a Maesta. And then if we look from, well, up above, we have a crucifixion scene. And then as we look from left to right, we've got St. Jerome and St. Augustine. And then we have two unidentified saints. We're not exactly sure who those saints are. We're not going to look at these in detail, so let's not be too worried about that. And then if we start at the bottom right, these two scenes right here show the crucifixion of St. Peter, the beheading of St. John the Baptist. This is the adoration of the Magi. We'll look at that in a moment. And then we have this one, which is St. Julian slaying his parents, which is a very dark story, but we'll go through it quickly. And then St. Nicholas saving three sisters from prostitution. So let's look here first at the adoration of the Magi. I wanted to show you the whole reconstruction because I think it's important to have a sense for where these pieces would have originally existed. So these big grand altar pieces, I like to call them encyclopedias of narrative, because there's so many different stories that are being told or that are being made reference to with symbolism, that if you talked about each piece of this, I mean, this could take us until middle of the afternoon to tell all of these stories. So we'll move it along and look at adoration of the Magi. So this is one of Masaccio's best known works, and I have to make a little adjustment here. Excuse me. Sorry, I messed up one of my screen settings. So this is one of Masaccio's best known pieces, The Adoration of the Magi. So first, I'm just going to describe the scene, and then let's look to some of the details within it. So the story of the Adoration of the Magi is that Jesus is born, and here he sits rather regally in the lap of the Virgin Mary, and he is visited by our three kings. And these three kings are tended by their various retinues. So we know who the three kings are because each one of them is having a crown removed or has removed a crown from them. So here's one kneeling down in adoration. You can see that he's removed his crown and placed it on the ground here. We have another one right here, and the attendant is removing his crown. And we have the third here with another attendant in the background reaching up to remove that crown. That's just a really interesting detail that helps us tell the story that we have these three kings that are visiting from afar, and they come in adoration, and in respect, they remove the crowns from their head. So they gather around and they bow down in reverence with their hands folded in front of them. And then as we look back to other figures in the scene, we have these two gentlemen here. And they look a little out of place, don't they? Their costume is a little bit different. We'll get back to them in a second. Hold that thought. And then we have, if we look in between them, we can make out some other little faces that are obscured as if this is kind of a little crowd gathering. We have the horses that are all askew, facing in different directions, and we can see different figures here and a little face there attending to them. So we have a lot of everyday detail, as if the horses have just been brought together and they're shuffling around there. And then if we look at our far left, we have the manger scene. So we have a few animals within the manger. Now I'm just going to address it right now because any minute somebody's going to type in the chat box, what is this thing right here that I'm going around with my mouse? And that is an excellent question. And if I knew what that thing was, I would tell you, but I don't. So it does not look to be an animal because if we zoomed in on it, it's far too rigid and it doesn't have a head. So I am not really a farm girl. So I really can't tell you. Somebody's suggesting that it's a saddle. Peter Jennings, it could very well be a saddle. So the two suggestions that I've had, that indeed perhaps it is some sort of a saddle, or that it's a milking stool. But again, growing up in the suburbs of St. Louis, I really can't illuminate that. We'll just leave that detail to, it's an everyday detail. Some sort of an item that if one saw many mangers might identify. So we have a lot of everyday detail. So one thing to note is that the figures in the painting are of appropriate scale to their surroundings. So we have, a manger is a rather meager architectural kind of a form. So we have figures here that look to be of appropriate height to the manger, as well as the hills that are in the distance are diminished in their size as well. So we have Masaccio that's paying attention to a sense of scale and what that shows us with the illusion of space. We are also seeing what the same kind of details that we noticed with our Virgin Mary, with the drapery of the figures showing light and shadow. Now what we can see here that we couldn't see so well in the other one is the figures themselves are casting shadows. So look at the shadows on the ground behind each figure. So that suggests an illusion of space as well. And then some of these just everyday details that I've pointed out about how the horses are kind of moving about in the background, and we have this everyday manger kind of a scene. That shows observation of nature too, that Masaccio is thinking about, well, what would be in a manger? How would the horses behave as just after they've been dismounted and servants are gathering them together? And then that brings us to these two figures that are in different costume in the foreground. So these two figures here are the two members of the family who donated money for the creation of this altarpiece. Now, this happens very often in Renaissance art, and we're going to see at least one more example of it today, if not more than that. So the donors for the works oftentimes are given portraits within the painting. And that's kind of the way of just recognizing the patrons of the work of art. Kind of like now, if people donate to the building of a building, they might have a plaque or their names on a wall. So it's a way of recognizing them. And oftentimes they are shown just in the contemporary dress of the time they lived in. And so that's how they stand out as not being just one of the attendants at this scene. So they're wearing contemporary Renaissance dress. So we have our Adoration of the Magi. Now, let's look on to these other two stories here. So these are both within the same panel, but the panel has been subdivided so as to be able to tell two stories. So when we looked at the digital reconstruction of the altarpiece, you saw the different squares. So the smaller scenes that are across the bottom down below, those are called predella scenes. So that just signifies where they were in the altarpiece. So that's why it says scenes from predella, piece of altarpiece here. So there's two stories that are being told. Let's start on the left. The stories are divided by what is painted to look like a rather, weathered and old wooden architectural beam between the two of them. So this story here on the left is completely separate from that story. So let's start with this one. So the scene on the left is Saint Julian slaying his parents. I told you it was kind of a dark scene, so we'll just kind of go through it quickly. So Saint Julian is a legendary saint. And there's a story about him that one day he was out hunting. He was hunting stag, and he was presented with a vision. And this vision foretold the future for him. And it foretold that he would kill his parents. And so he was horrified. And so when he returned home to his parents' home, he left his parents' home because he thought if he just left, this horrible act that had been foretold in his future would not happen. So he went off to another land, and he became a knight, and he married a woman, and they had a life together. But Julian's parents were very saddened by the departure of their son. They didn't know where he had gone, and so they started traveling the land searching for him. And so one day in their travels, they are, out of kindness, given lodging in the home of a knight and his wife, and unbeknownst to them, that was their son Julian's home. And so they are given lodging there. Julian is not home. The wife gives this couple the best bed in the house to sleep in, which is their own bed. And so the parents go to sleep, and they're in the bed. And so then Julian comes home and sees these two people in the bed, and it's dark and it's nighttime, and so he thinks it's his wife having an affair with somebody else, so he slays the two people in the bed. And then it's revealed that, oh no, those are my parents, and this was foretold, and you can't beat fate. So it's kind of a dark story, but it's a beautiful painting by Masaccio. So here's this act happening right here. Let's look at this in the background, which I think is the most significant part. So what Masaccio's doing is he's describing for us in his painting some really particular interior spaces. So we have this small little bedroom here, and then next to it we have this little hallway that leads us back into what our eyes are reading as a larger, more open, illuminated space in the background. And this is Julian right here. You can see he has his head in his hands because he's realized what he's done. And he's talking to his wife right here that, this terrible thing that he's realized he has done. And as the story continues, the two of them flee, but we won't keep following it because we don't have time for that. So this wonderful space in the background that has this opening that like arches and a colonnade up above, and it's flooded with light. So we can see that Masaccio is really playing with trying to create really intricate interior spaces. And then on the right, we have our story of St. Nicholas. And St. Nicholas is remembered, his legend is that he gave money to a family in need. There was becoming elderly father that had 3 daughters that he could not provide for, and he could not give dowry. So in an act of preventing them from having to choose a lifestyle of prostitution to support the family, St. Nicholas gives them, under the cover of night, a bag of gold. And so this is what we see St. Nicholas doing here. He's getting ready to toss this bag of gold straight in this window as they sleep at night. And you can see that this little hallway continues here, and we have another interior space in the background. So we see Masaccio really thinking about this illusion of space. Now, one of Masaccio's best known and most significant works is this one. This is the Holy Trinity with the Virgin and St. John. So I'm going to point out some of these details and then talk a little bit about the idea of measurement and perspective with this work. So everything that you're seeing here is painted. So even these architectural components they're painted, they're part of the fresco. But it just so happens that we were in the church of Santa Maria Novella, Florence, where this painting was originally created for, that the colonnade that we're seeing painted here actually echoes a real colonnade within the church. And that's kind of a key component to this. So we're seeing the Trinity. We have Christ on the cross. We have God the Father right behind him on a throne. And this white thing right here that our eyes kind of want to read like a white collar is a dove of the Holy Spirit. So we have the whole Trinity present. And then here we have the Virgin Mary, and then we have a Saint John that are in attendance. And then as we move forward in the composition, these 2 kneeling individuals are our donors. So those are donor portraits once again. And as we look down, there is this scene of a skeleton in a crypt. And that skeleton in the crypt is supposed to remind us of our mortality. And I think you can see, although you probably can't see very well, that there's a little inscription right here. So that inscription says, "What you are, I once was. What I am, you will become." So it's reminding us of that, of our mortality. What's interesting about this detail of this painted crypt is that this painted crypt actually, in the fresco cycle of the church, is immediately above a real crypt that's down below. So the painting is kind of, in a way, anchored within the architectural scape because of some measurements of columns and where this painted crypt is placed. Now, what's particularly significant about this painting is its perspective, because this is one of the first times that we see Masaccio very much taking hold and grabbing onto this idea of linear perspective. And think back to those diagonal lines we saw in the diagrams. We can see what I always call in my mind the ghosts of those linear perspective lines in the lines of the painted architecture, like the lines in between these coffers going back. Just like with that train track, let your eyes kind of imagine those lines continuing, and they meet at a vanishing point in this imagined distance. And that vanishing point is right here. It's at the focal point of our composition with Christ on the cross. So we see him at play with linear perspective. Now, it just so happens that this particular painting, we know that it's flat because it's a fresco painting, but it creates this imagined niche of space behind the Trinity. And because Masaccio followed quite carefully measurement when he created this, art historians have been able to compare the measurements of the architectural components in the painting to the architectural components that actually exist in the Church of Santa Maria Novella. And they've been able to use those measurements to extrapolate back in space how deep this actual niche would be. So I could list for you and read to you a list of all of those measurements, but I won't. I'm just going to say, trust me, there's a list of all those measurements, and that list of measurements tells us that this niche is 9 feet deep. So we see the complete overlap of the idea of mathematics and art within this concept of linear perspective that is so central in Masaccio's work. So let's look at something a little different. Let's look at a portrait. And this is a profile portrait of a young man. We don't know exactly who this sitter was. And this is in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And I was in Washington, D.C. in front of this painting, I think about 4 years ago now. And my family got very impatient with me because I just wanted to stay and stare at it all day because it was a real Masaccio right in front of me. But so I will always remember it quite well. Now, portraiture within the Renaissance is also a very important art form, because prior to the Renaissance, we don't really see a lot of portraiture in art. Occasionally, we might see a king who is pictured within a grand fresco scene or a mosaic scene during the Middle Ages, but we really don't see portraiture of, you know, I want to say everyday people, but let's be honest, aristocratic people. We don't see that very often. And the reason we don't see it very often is because the idea of humanism is something that is a chief philosophical thinking of the day during the Renaissance. And the idea of humanism upholds the value of the individual. And so a great deal of emphasis is placed within the thinking of humanism on individual education and upholding the talent and the talent and the abilities and the achievements of individuals. And so when we get into the Renaissance, not only do we start to see the work of individual artists being recognized, but we start to see the identity of individual people is starting to be captured in portraiture. So within the history of European painting, we really don't have a lot of portraiture before the Renaissance. So this is a very significant thing that we're seeing. So this particular portrait of a young man is done in profile. And that is simply an artistic convention that has existed for many centuries within Europe, is that showing a profile image of a noteworthy member of the family could often be within a coat of arms for a family, or oftentimes a family might have kind of commemorative coins struck with a profile image of a noteworthy person of the family, just in remembrance or in honor. And so there's so much history of profile, so that when we start to see these portraits, oftentimes they are in profile. So looking at this, and we've all had time to ponder it a little bit, I think we're seeing a lot of the same ideas of naturalism that we were seeing in some of these grander scenes. We've talked a lot about folds of drapery, and that certainly exists with the head treatment that we have on this young man's face. And then because we're able to see this face so up close, we're really able to appreciate the subtlety of the modeling and the shading of the contours of his face. Like this very subtle shadow that's cast as his chin stretches up and meets his neck here. The really subtle shadowing right around his eyes and on the side of his brow. You know, look at the little treatment of kind of where the lips come together right here. Just amazing sense of individual detail, capturing the contours of the face and the likeness of the figure. Now this brings us to some of Masaccio's most important works. And I think I'm saying that with everything that we talk about. There's not all that many Masaccios, they're all important. But this is a view of the Brancacci Chapel. And the Brancacci Chapel is in the Church of Santa Maria del Carmine in Florence. So we had Santa Maria del Carmine in Pisa before, this is Carmine in Florence. which can be very confusing, but I've got it straight in my notes. So this is Santa Maria della Carmine in Florence, and it's the Brancacci Chapel. So the tradition at the time is that our grand churches would have networks of smaller side chapels. And oftentimes families of note within a community would commission the decoration of these chapels, and then it would be titled in their name. So the Brancacci Chapel is just that. The Brancacci Chapel were the patrons of this particular, this cycle of frescoes. So what Masaccio created, and some of the frescoes in this chapel are actually done by the other Tom. Remember, we had Big Clumsy Tom and we had Little Tom. So we have Masaccio, we have Masolino. Masolino finished some of these works, and he created some of these. So the frescoes that you're seeing on the walls are Renaissance. This particular panel, one panel altarpiece, is medieval, so that's why it appears to be very different. And then the frescoes that stretch up onto the ceiling were done about a century later. So we're going to ignore all that, and we're just going to look at a few of these details. So I want to show you a wall. So to give you a sense of where the artwork is that we're going to be looking at, we're going to look at the expulsion, which is right here. We're going to look at the tribute money, which is right here. And then we're going to look at a scene from the life of St. Peter, which is down here on the bottom right. And let's start with St. Peter. So I'm going to tell you the story in short, and while I'm telling it, all of you look at the painting, and then I'm going to ask you to share some details that you're seeing. So the story is St. Peter healing the sick with his shadow. And the story is taken out of the Acts of the Apostles, where the apostles had been traveling and performing miracles. And word got out that this was happening. And so as people are hearing that St. Peter is coming, they start to bring their sick out and line them up on the street in hopes that when St. Peter walks by, the shadow of St. Peter will cast upon these people with their various ailments, and that they'll be healed in a miracle of the shadow of St. Peter. So that's the figures that we're seeing right here lined up. And this is St. Peter, and here's some other figures here traveling with him. So as we're looking at this scene, I would like for you to suggest what are some of the details that you see that are cueing us to this observation of nature, that Masaccio is looking to the world around him to inform what he paints in his scene, that we see naturalism with figures or naturalism with space. What noteworthy details are we seeing? And you can add it into the chat box. Shadowing, definitely we're seeing some shadowing. And the shadowing, that's a really important part of the story too. It furthers the narrative. So details of individual bricks, linear horizontal lines on the tops of the building, perspective of the street. This is great, you guys are getting all the details. So let's talk first a little bit about that idea of shadow. So not only is it part of the narrative, the actual shadow of St. Peter we see falling onto these, and that's these individuals, and that's part of the story. We're certainly seeing the shadows created by the garments. We're seeing shadows on various parts of the building, as one chat noted, upon the bricks. And we can see that this is in greater shadow than this piece of the architecture as well in the background. So a real observation of nature, of how light interacts with objects around us. So that's certainly informed by an observation of nature. And we're also seeing these diagonal perspective lines. Now, what's interesting here is that it's a little bit different, because when we see perspective lines, according to the diagram I shared with you, it really pushes those perspective lines toward a center. But here, Masaccio is playing with that, and all of those perspective lines are very abruptly kind of leading from our left to our right, back in space. And so then as St. Peter moves forward, as that space is receding back, he seems to kind of be coming close to us. So, but we certainly do have those diagonal lines of perspective that take us back illusionistically into space. We've got different types of buildings. We certainly do have a contrast of the rich to the poor. So we have some individual characterization where St. Peter and those with him appear to be, for lack of a better term, a little less haggard than the other ones. And that characterizes our figures, and that supports the narrative. We see certainly as St. Peter walks, he is walking with kind of this contrapposto pose. So we have that shift of the human body as well. And everyday detail, the bricks were noted. We have different kinds of bricks. And these bricks appear to kind of be a little bit more weathered than the more serene, smooth architectural surface here. If we look to the background, look at this grand column. That's suggesting perhaps a church or an important civic building. So this really everyday sense of detail once again. Now I'm going to point out another thing that maybe one of you know, but if not, I'll give you this little bit of trivia. So you see this face right in between St. Peter and his attending figure here, this little face in the background. That is a portrait, and it's a portrait of Donatello. So Masaccio was a great follower, and he learned a lot from the work of sculptor Donatello. And so he placed this little portrait of Donatello within the painting. And again, these little portraits weave their way into Renaissance art very often. And we're going to look at Donatello in 2 weeks. So little preview there. All right, let's look at the next one. The expulsion. Now, I put up these two side by side because this tells you what conservation work does. So on your right was this particular panel, the expulsion in the Brancacci Chapel. I want to say this conservation work was done about 15, 20 years ago, to give you an estimate. And so you can, and then on the left, of course, is the cleaned piece. So when we say conservation, or when we say restoration, what the modern thinking on that is that you never add paint to a work of a master. You simply clean it. So you can see that cleaning all the grime off of this painting changed it completely. When these works started to be conserved, this one was done about 15, 20 years ago, but speaking about Renaissance art in general, when these works started to be conserved, like in the 80s, all of a sudden scholars had to adjust their concepts of the palette of Renaissance artists because it was much brighter than what they had thought, just because there was so much grime upon many of these works, you know, like the soot of candles and just dust and things over time. So this is the finished piece. Now this also shows you, I think you're noting from the before and the after, that there's two elements that don't exist after because they were added. So sometime during the 17th century, in an act of modesty, someone painted fig leaves over our figures of Adam and Eve, because that would be a little bit more seemly for the inside of a chapel, but they were not what was originally intended by Masaccio. So when they cleaned away all the grit, there went the fig leaves as well. So let's look at this scene up a little bit more specifically. So Masaccio is doing wonderful things with this particular scene that are really very expressive. So we all know that the story of the expulsion, that we have Adam and Eve, they're in the Garden of Eden, they're in paradise, they eat the apple of the tree of knowledge, they get kicked out of paradise. So God sends an angel to kick them out, and that's the angel here. They're passing out of the gate of the Garden of Eden, and these black lines are meant to suggest to us the booming voice of God kicking them out of paradise. Now, Masaccio has done some wonderful things here that are very expressive. What are some details that you're seeing that really help to tell this story? And we can add that in the chat box. Definitely a great sense of emotion is being shown. And the covering up, the contortion of Eve's face. So he's using how he depicts the human form in such a way to suggest this point of the story and the anguish of when they have been kicked out of the Garden of Eden. So rather than very idealized statuesque forms like we know that Masaccio can depict for us, he's showing these forms as very hunched over and kind of contorted, covering up their bodies, covering up their faces in shame. And then we have this wonderful expression of Eve with her eyes kind of closed and cast down and her mouth just open, you know, as if in a sigh or some sort of a noise of dismay or of lament. And they, you know, they walk forward in space, but they do so in a way that seems rather downtrodden, kind of with, you know, trailing feet behind and that sort of thing. So he's captured a great deal of emotionality that furthers our narrative. Okay, and here we have a scene of the tribute money. And this is another one of the most well-known scenes of Masaccio. So I'm going to tell you the story and point out the details as we go, and then we'll point out some very important details or some very important artistic points. The first thing to note is that we have a scene with what we call continuous narrative. So that means that we're seeing figures depicted more than once, and each time they are depicted, we see a different piece of the story. So let's just start it in the center. So the story of the tribute money is told in Matthew, and we have Christ right here, and he instructs Peter right here to go to catch a fish, because in the mouth of the fish, he will find money that they have to pay the tax collector. And this individual here is the tax collector. So here we have Peter here, and he's been summoned off, fingers pointing in this direction. And here is Peter again. And he's leaning down to the water. He has caught a fish, and he's going to take that coin out of the mouth of the fish. And then he's going to take that and go over here, and he's handing it to the tax collector. See this tax collector, and here's the tax collector again. So we have this scene of continuous narrative. And that's an artistic convention that we've seen for many centuries now, of this idea of just repeating figures to give us different pieces of vignettes of a story. So a few artistic things to note is that we have wonderful sense of mass with the figures, the same treatment of drapery that's showing us shadows, as well as when the drapery pulls across the human form, we can kind of surmise their movement underneath. We see a wonderful sense of use of light, not only the shadows of the drapery, but of the shadows behind some of these figures here. We can see shadows casting upon the ground. And we have what's called, or I like to call, this Renaissance sense of space. We have suggestions of our perspective. Once again, we can kind of trace this in the architectural component here, those orthogonals or those linear perspective lines as we go back in space. But we also have a very firm foreground and background, or we can even say foreground, middle ground, and background in the painting. Our figures are in the foreground. Then we have one section of landscape that's immediately behind them, our middle ground, and then our very distant landscape, that's our background. So this suggestion of things in front of the next part give us a recession of space. Now, another thing to note is something we haven't really talked about, but this is a good example of, is another thing that we call aerial perspective. So the idea of aerial perspective is that when we're very close to something, we see the details quite clearly. But as things become more and more distant to us, we don't see those details nearly as clearly. So, for example, if you had a plant right in front of you, you might be able to see every detail of the leaves on that plant. But if you were looking out your window at a tree in your neighbor's house across the street from you, as I am doing right now, I can't see every detail of all the leaves on that tree. And that's how aerial perspective works. So if we look at the wonderful detail of all of these folds of drapery, we can even see that Peter appears to be he's knit his brow here. We can make out all those details. But if you look back to the very far distance, we have a softer sense of line. We don't have that sense of exacting detail. So that is our example of aerial perspective. And if anyone accidentally unmutes themselves, if they could mute themselves, that would be great. It happens sometimes. Now to kind of round out our view and show you another type of a painting, I brought out this one. And this is a scene of the Nativity. It's really quite grand in what it's showing, because when we think of a scene of the Nativity, we go back to that manger with like the donkeys and things. And this is just a really grand nativity within this architectural structure. But we see that this is a round painting, and we call that a tondo. So in Renaissance art, especially in Florence, the round painting form or tondos are very popular. And it's simply just kind of a fashion of 15th century Florence. It's just something that's very popular among art collectors. And so we see a lot of round paintings or tondos that come out of Florence during the Renaissance. And these would be things that would be in like smaller collections. So it's not a grand thing upon a church wall. It's a smaller, more intimate piece. So we're seeing the scene of the Nativity here. And I think somebody's asking about the frame. So the tondo would have been framed in a very beautiful, ornate, wooden, perhaps gilded wood frame. And that is no longer on the piece. So this white you're seeing around the outside is just basically kind of like background in a photograph. So we kind of think that part of it away. So our nativity is happening kind of in three compartments of this wonderful architectural scape. So we have the Virgin Mary still in bed, and we have all sorts of attendants around her that are holding the Christ child there. And somebody got disconnected. I'm going to let them back in. And then we have this wonderful retinue of women, and two of them appear to be nuns. I'm going to comment on that in a minute. And they're walking down this hallway, kind of like they've hurried to hear the news, and they're coming in the room to see the child that's just been born. And then we have these a proclamation. We have like a wonderful herald that is playing this horn as if to let everyone know that this has happened. And so this is a very different kind of nativity scene. It's like it's been placed in a completely different context than the narrative would typically be told, which is fine. Artists can make those artistic choices. But I don't know a lot about what we would call the provenance of this piece. And it's something that really would be interesting for further study. So maybe I'll do that. But basically the provenance of a piece of art is the story or the history of the piece itself. So from the time that the artwork left the hands of the artist, everyone who had owned it and everywhere it had been. So I wonder if this was for a private collection in a convent, because it's unusual to see a painting of a nun in painting. It's just very unusual to see that. So I almost wonder if a convent commissioned this piece, and in a nod to the patronage, just like we have our donor portraits, they've put it within a recognizable architectural scape of their convent, and it gives it kind of that personal touch. But wonderful sense of, again, the perspective. Whoops. Wonderful sense of the perspective with the architecture and the columns that now I think we can all point out, or I think we can all pick out very easily. And then I'm seeing some comments. Interesting wall treatment, very much so, that even makes it seem more specific, like Masaccio's painting a specific place. And then red flower or red fleur-de-lis is a symbol of Florence. So, you know, perhaps it's a convent in Florence. I think I might be looking into that one a little bit more. Now, this one is kind of like a 2-for-1, because this is what's on the front. Now, this is painted on a wood panel that would have been treated and then painted upon. So this is painted on the front, but this is what's on the back. So sometimes that happens, and you have like a front and then you have a reverse. And the reverse is a scene of what we would call simply a puto and a small dog. And it's a very vexing dog. It kind of looks like a combination between a dog, a cat, and a ferret, but we'll just let it go because it's on the back of the painting. But a puto is just basically kind of like our cherub-like figures. They're kind of just peripheral decorative figures. Sometimes they're winged and sometimes they're not. And you can see the wearing of that panel too, that wood panel on the back. It's just kind of interesting to see. Now, our last work of Masaccio is this one. And this is a painting of St. Jerome and St. John the Baptist. And my eye caught a question. What is the red stamp on the right? So let's see, let me go back. Let me see if I can go back. I can. I have the technology. Okay. The red stamp on the right. That would be some sort of a stamp of ownership. So if I was able to decipher what that was, that would help this, because it is some sort of a stamp of ownership, you know, done in wax, like a wax seal. So interesting point to note. Thanks for asking about that. Okay, so we have St. Jerome and St. John the Baptist. Now, this is the last work of Masaccio, and it's actually unfinished. And we'll look at some of the unfinished pieces because they're interesting. And it was last year of his life. Masaccio left Florence to go do work in Rome. And he had to leave behind some of his Florentine commissions to do a commission in Rome. And artists would often do that. They would get a big commission, and so they travel and work on that for a while, and then they come back and finish what they had left behind. And it just so happened that he left behind unfinished work at the Brancacci Chapel that we just looked at. And so his counterpart, nicknamed Massolino, finished some of those works for him. And so he was commissioned to do an altarpiece, but he only got started on the left side of it when he died unexpectedly. And so this is St. Jerome right here in red, and we have St. John the Baptist. Now, we know who these gentlemen are because of their attributes. So St. John the Baptist is a saint that we often see wearing kind of an animal skin garment. And if we peek underneath this pinkish cloak that he's wearing, you can see kind of the, especially along the bottom here, this rough edge as if it's some sort of like an animal skin or a fur or a hair shirt is what he's often shown in. And then he carries a long crossed staff. And here he has this pink cloak on top of it, very vibrant color of pink. This is not a finished work, so we can maybe think to ourselves that that might have been altered a little bit in color if Masaccio was able to finish it. And then we have St. Jerome, and St. Jerome is remembered for a medieval story where he removed a thorn from a lion's paw. And as he did that, the lion became his companion and servant. So we have a lion at the lower left. And then St. Jerome is also remembered as a scholar, and notably his Latin translation of the Bible. So he holds a Bible. And the particular church that this was created for was the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. And St. Jerome was thought to be buried underneath that church. So he was the patron of that church, or a patron saint of that church. So he holds this little church model in his hand because that becomes an attribute as well. Now, Masaccio did not have the opportunity to finish this, and looking at the obvious unfinished area is really kind of interesting, and that's this area with his hands. I think we can immediately see the extreme whiteness of this just doesn't seem quite done. So let's look at it. So even though we haven't quite got our skin tone and we don't have all those details, we can see that he's working on the finer things, like when our thumb and our hand meet, we've got those little lines. I can't help but look down when I describe it. We've got those little lines on our hand. We can see him capturing that right there. And then wonderful to see up close, the print in the Bible that he's holding. If I could read Latin, I can tell you what it is, but I don't read Latin, I only read Greek. So, but if anybody reads Latin, perhaps you could suggest what this is. But very exacting, so minute that we can make out all the letters and all the forms. And then just seeing up close those folds that fall into shadow there, just a wonderful sense of detail. So this is the last work of Masaccio. Now, Masaccio died unexpectedly in 1428 at age 27. And there is a biographer and, okay, somebody, Peter Jennings, you studied your Latin. We should continue this all summer. Oh, Peter Jennings, I thought that you were translating it for me. So, but I think we will continue this all summer. But back to the work at hand. I'll stop paying attention to the chats. It's distracting me. So he died unexpectedly. Now, there was an author at the time named Giorgio Vasari. And some of you might be familiar with the name Giorgio Vasari. And he wrote a very important work. Actually, he was not contemporary with Masaccio, but he wrote a very important work called The Lives of the Artists. And in it, he wrote just basically the histories of all of the significant artists of the Italian Renaissance. And Masaccio is one of those that was featured. And so the description of the death of Masaccio in Vasari is described as a sudden and very unfortunate loss, because many artists after the work of Masaccio follow Masaccio's work. Artists from all over Italy went to Florence to see what he had created, and they emulated his technique and his style in their work. Now, chief among those that we remember as an ardent student of the work of Masaccio is Michelangelo. So this that you're seeing on your right is from the tribute money. That's our image of St. Peter. And he's handing those coins to the tax collector. So this is just a detail from that tribute money painting that we saw not long ago. And then on the left, this is Michelangelo, his sketch of what he saw in his drawings of Masaccio's work. Because Michelangelo would sit in the Brancacci Chapel as well as in many other places, and he would simply draw what he saw in those paintings. And that helped to inform his ability as an artist to sculpt as well as to paint. And of course, we'll be looking at Michelangelo in several weeks. So, pulling up our very last slide is our schedule. Now, unfortunately, I will not be able to be with you next week, but have no fear, there are recordings. Some of you may have seen all of them so far, maybe not all of them, but they're all up there. Not only from this series, but as well as from the series that we did prior to this that started in late March. So if any of you would like to watch those, you most certainly can. What you need to do is, our website is right here. We're the Shepherd Center of Webster-Kirkwood in the St. Louis area. And so it's www.shepherds, with an S, center-wk.org. And if you go to our website, on our homepage, there's an icon that looks like this. It says online classes. If you click on that, it'll take you to an online class page that not only has information about all of these classes, but it has recordings. And all you need to do is click on the link and the recording will come up. You don't need to download anything. So I refer you to that. So we will come back together kind of live on screen on May 22nd, and we will talk about Donatello. So I hope that all of you have a wonderful 2 weeks. I hope that all of the mothers among us have a wonderful Mother's Day, although our celebrations might be a little bit different than they are. I happen to know that my mom is on the line. So hi, Mom. I'll see you tomorrow. We have a social distance celebration plan, so nobody fear, we'll be safe. And I will see you back on screen on May 22nd. So thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Donatello, Botticelli, and Michelangelo.
Yeah, and a selection of women artists. Don't forget the ladies. Okay.
Oh my good. In June.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.